Lucius Verus, one of the least regarded Roman emperors, he's often written off as a playboy and a party animal. Later sources are strangely hostile towards him, and he is often dismissed by modern historians as a mere shadow of his more famous adoptive brother, Marcus Aurelius. But Verus led a successful campaign against Rome's rival in the east, the Parthian Empire. A shout out to the History Chronicles, a brand new channel from our narrator, Alexander. The History Chronicles delves into the events and lives that have shaped human history. Please check out our latest video, The Invention of Flight, and learn how mankind took to the skies. Now, back to the video. Born Lucius Aeonius Commodus on the 15th of December 130 AD in Rome, Lucius came from a distinguished line of consulars on his father's side, dating back to his great-grandfather. His mother was Avidia Plautia, who was probably an ancestor of Aulus Plautius, who led Claudius's invasion of Britain in 43 AD. Lucius was only 6 years old in 136 AD when his father was adopted by the sitting emperor, Hadrian, to become his successor. Suddenly, the young Lucius was thrust on the main stage, and people would have looked at him as a possible future inheritor of the imperial throne after his father's reign. But those speculations soon came to an abrupt halt when Lucius's father suddenly died on the 24th of January 138 AD, only 36 years old. That would have been it for young Lucius. Without his father, who was said to become the next emperor, what chance did Lucius have? Perhaps he would be removed, so as not to have any claim on the imperial throne. But Hadrian saw something in the young boy, and when he selected his new successor, Antoninus the Pious, he did so on the condition that Antoninus would in turn adopt young Lucius and another young man who Hadrian seems to have had an affinity for, Marcus. This adoption was later depicted on a monument in Ephesus to honor Lucius after his death. On the left we can see Marcus Aurelius, now a young man with curly hair. Next to him stands their new father, Antoninus the Pious, embracing the young Lucius. And on the far right stands Hadrian. Lucius was now known as Lucius Aelius Aurelius Commodus, and Marcus changed his name to Marcus Aelius Aurelius Verus, now commonly referred to as Marcus Aurelius. Hadrian suffered from some sort of ailment towards the end of his reign, and much of his time had been devoted to securing the succession. This task was now complete. Not only did he have a reliable successor who would honor his policies in Antoninus the Pious, he also had 2 spare Caesars, if and when the empire called upon them. The imperial throne was secure for the foreseeable future. Was it Hadrian's intention that Lucius and Marcus should rule together? We don't know for sure, but Marcus's subsequent actions suggest it may well have been. What is clear is the fondness they seem to have for each other. Marcus, who was older, took young Lucius under his wing. Both of them had lost their father at a young age, and this probably strengthened the bond with each other. The sources suggest that Antoninus favored Marcus over Lucius. Perhaps he found a kindred spirit in Marcus, or the boys were simply treated differently due to the age difference. Marcus was almost 10 years older than Lucius. Another factor that might have played a part in this notion is the fact that Hadrian had insisted that Lucius was to be betrothed to Antoninus's daughter, Annia Galaria Faustina. Antoninus annulled this betrothal in favor of Marcus. Though Lucius and Faustina were closer in age, in Roman eyes, Marcus was a more natural match for Faustina because he was older. We know more of Lucius's educators than most emperors. The Historia Augusta lists Lucius's tutors, men presumably thought of as leaders in their fields by his adoptive father. It's a diverse list of experts from all across the empire, a rhetorician from Alexandria in Egypt, a historian from Pergamum in Asia Minor, a legal expert from Numidia, and a son of one of Hadrian's own grammarians, Scorinus, who lived long enough to educate the future emperor Severus Alexander. And many, many more grammarians and philosophers were tasked with educating young Lucius. He entered public life as a quaestor in 153 AD, and during his quaestorship, he held gladiatorial games in Rome. sitting in a place of honor between Antoninus and Marcus Aurelius. In the following year, 154 AD, he was consul at the young age of 24. When Antoninus passed away on the 7th of March 161 AD, Marcus succeeded him on the imperial throne, and immediately recognized Lucius as his co-emperor. It's unknown if that was a plan Hadrian had laid out before his death, or an innovation by Marcus. Perhaps Hadrian intended Marcus to be the senior Augustus, and Lucius to be his junior Caesar. To make it clear to all that they were indeed equals, they both adopted the titles of Caesar and Augustus. The adoptive brothers had become very close to each other, and Lucius's appointment as joint emperor might have been seen as a result of his closeness, but perhaps more practical reasons might have motivated Marcus to promote Lucius as his equal. One reason might be that by promoting Lucius, he would keep him out of mischief and preempt any future usurpation. Another reason might be that Marcus, who saw himself as a philosopher rather than a military commander, which is ironic considering his later years, wanted Lucius to deal with military matters. The epitome of Cassius Dio records that Lucius, on the other hand, was a vigorous man of younger years and better suited for military enterprises. Therefore, Marcus made him his son-in-law by marrying him to his daughter Lucilla, and sent him to conduct the war against the Parthians. Another reason might, of course, be that this had been Hadrian's plan all along, and Marcus honoured his adoptive grandfather. There were probably both practical and personal reasons why Marcus made the decision. Either way, they were now both Emperor of Rome. The soldiers, and particularly the Praetorian Guard, expected a large donative upon their succession. Of the two emperors, Lucius Verus was selected to go to the Praetorian Guard and address the troops. Though both Lucius and Marcus were schooled in oratory, the selection of Lucius has been seen as significant. Marcus would, later in his life, comment on his brother's oratory skill in a letter to Fronto. Upon his ascension to emperor, Lucius once again changed name, this time to Imperator Caesar Lucius Aurelius Verus Augustus. That same year, 161 AD, Marcus had his second son and named him Commodus to honour his adoptive brother. Lucius was born with that cognomen. War in the East. The Armenian kingdom was the buffer state between Rome and Parthia, and it played a key part in Romano-Parthian relations. Each side wanted to control Armenia, and it was only too willing to go to war over it. Practically all wars between the two powers were fought over Armenia, and which power had the upper hand in the internal affairs of the buffer state. At the same time Lucius and Marcus ascended to power, the Parthians marched into Armenia to replace a pro-Roman king with someone more favourable to Parthian interests. It's likely that this was a direct reaction to the change of power in Rome. Perhaps the Parthians expected Rome to be weakened after the loss of their emperor for over 20 years. The army commander in Cappadocia, Sidatius Severianus, marched into Armenia to regain the initiative, but was besieged in Elegia and lost a legion before taking his own life. After the Parthians had succeeded in subduing Armenia, they marched south and into the Roman province of Syria. The Syrian province was the most prestigious province a senator could hold. At this time the governor was Titus Cornelianus, who marched his 2 legions to face the Parthian intrusion. Cornelianus was defeated, and the eastern part of the empire lay open for attack. News probably reached Rome in 162 AD, and Lucius was selected for the campaign. The 2 emperors marched southward in Italy to set sail from Brundisium. Marcus accompanied his brother all the way to Capua before heading back to Rome, but Lucius suddenly became very ill at Canusium. Marcus hurried back to Lucius, joining his brother. Our sources claim that the illness was due to Lucius's overindulgent and riotous lifestyle, but we have to consider this first sign of illness if this was the same illness that would take his life a few years later, or if this was a separate ailment. We simply don't have enough information. Lucius Verus soon got better and continued his journey east, crossing into Greece from Brundisium, visiting Corinth and Athens, before heading over to Anatolia, where he took a coastal route, visiting many important cities along the way. Our sources claim that Lucius's journey to Syria was taking longer than was common, and that his slow progress was due to his debauched lifestyle. But we have to consider his situation. Troops had to be moved from the Danube to reinforce the east. These troops would arrive very late in the campaigning season. If we assume that the Parthians invaded Armenia as soon as they received the news of Antoninus' death in March of 161 AD, it would probably take the news to reach Parthia about a month, and another month for the news to reach Rome of the Parthian invasion. That news would, at the very earliest, reach Rome in May. Informing the troops on the Danube, it would take another month or so. That brings us into June. The troops had to move from the Mosian provinces some 2,000 kilometers to reach the theatre of war. They would, optimistically, reach Syria in August. So no military intervention into Armenia was realistically possible until the following season. The Roman campaigning season was normally from the 23rd of March to the 19th of October. It can be argued that Lucius Verus should have hurried to Syria to try to secure the situation, but without a substantial military force to safeguard the emperor, and with the Parthian army active in the region, it seems like a risky proposition. When Lucius and the reinforcing army reached Syria, 2 campaigns were planned. One army was to march into Armenia in the north and reach Artaxata, the Armenian capital. Another army was to cross into Ossorun and head into the Parthian heartland. The Syrian legions were in a bad state even before their defeat at the hands of the Parthians. It states that the soldiers were more often found in the nearest cafe garden than in the ranks. Lucius Verus inspected each part of the army and rewarded the good parts handsomely, so that others might follow that example, trying to restore discipline. The Syrian forces' morale was poor due to the recent defeat, but Lucius sent them out on small skirmishes he knew they could win, to slowly build their confidence before a large-scale military campaign. Rome had suffered 2 major defeats at the hands of the Parthians, but Rome had one advantage over the Parthian army. While the Parthians could field a large force, it was a feudal force, which was at its best when tackling one enemy at a time, while Rome could run several wars simultaneously due to the modular nature of the Roman command structure and the semi-professionalism of its army. A war on 2 fronts was easier for the Romans than the Parthians. In 163 AD, it was time to go to war and restore Roman pride. The first phase of the campaign was aimed at restoring Roman control in Armenia. As so often is the case in ancient history, our sources on this campaign are lacking. But it's likely that the Armenian campaign set out from Cappadocia rather than Syria, aiming at retaking the Armenian capital. Lucius himself remained in Antioch, while direct command was Statius Priscus. The campaign culminated with the capture of Artaxata, and Armenia was reconstructed on Roman terms. The Armenian capital was moved 30 Roman miles closer to the Roman border. The city was known as Cainopolis, meaning new city in Greek. And a new king was installed on the Armenian throne. A Roman senator of consular rank, Julius Sohaemus, was a man of Arsacid descent. The Arsacid was the ruling family of the Parthian Empire, and an old treaty between Rome and Parthia stated that the king of Armenia was to be a member of that dynasty, but he was to be crowned by Rome. The first phase of Lucius's Eastern War was complete. Statius Priscus moved back to Cappadocia and left a garrison in the new Armenian capital. The rest of the forces continued south under the command of Claudius Fronto. Our sources are hostile towards Lucius because he stayed in Antioch throughout the campaign, but we have to consider that Lucius didn't have any military experience, so leaving command of the troops to someone more experienced was probably for the best, while he could direct the troops and the overall war goals from a distance and plan the next phase of the war. Trajan would lead the troops himself, but he was an experienced commander before becoming emperor. Lucius was not. It was probably a wise choice, realizing there were better men with more experience than himself to take direct command. Lucius adopted the name Armenicus after this successful stage of his campaign. With the situation in Armenia rectified to Roman satisfaction, Lucius's next phase of the war was dealing with Syria and Osroene. Osroene was a client kingdom to Rome, but the Parthians had now installed a Parthian-friendly king, which had to be remedied. A two-pronged attack into Osroene. One Roman army came from the north, led by Fronto, and the other Roman army advanced from the west, from Antioch, led by Avidius Cassius, who had overall command of the Roman forces. The Romans encountered the Parthian army at Europus. We know very little of this battle, but it seems to have been an overwhelming victory for Rome. And with this victory, the Parthian forces probably scattered or retreated to lick their wounds. Cassius took full advantage of their weakness and marched down the Euphrates towards the capital of Ctesiphon. On their way, they burned the Hellenistic city of Seleucia to the ground. During the sacking of Seleucia, a temple of Apollo was desecrated. Apollo was a god who could bring ill health and deadly plague with his arrows. This desecration was later seen as the cause of the Antonine Plague. The army continued to Ctesiphon and took the city. The royal palace was burnt to the ground. With the capture of the Parthian capital, this effectively marked the end of Lucius's Parthian wars. The return journey was not to be easy, though. Plague and famine racked Cassius's forces. This same Cassius would, years later in 175 AD, try to make a bid for the purple upon receiving false information that Marcus Aurelius had died. His short rebellion lasted only 3 months, and he was ultimately cut down by a centurion and his head sent to Rome. This Parthian war had been a massive success for the young emperor. He had dealt with Rome's greatest foe and restored Roman pride and hegemony in the region. But without more details, it is difficult to determine just how much of a part he played in this success, or if it's all thanks to his brilliant commanders. But this war matched Trajan's finest accomplishments in the region some 50 years earlier. Both emperors took the titles of Armenicus, Parthicus Maximus, and Medicus to celebrate the victory in Parthia. Upon his return to Rome in August of 166 AD, Lucius Verus and his brother Marcus Aurelius once again reunited and celebrated a triumph over Parthia. Marcus was the older of the two brothers and had started their joint emperorships with more authority, but with Lucius's recent military success in the east, he had now eclipsed Marcus in prestige. But Lucius did not capitalize on the situation. Instead, he showed magnanimity by sharing his triumph with Marcus and insisting that he adopted the titles of Armenicus, Parthicus, and Medicus. The victorious Lucius had also brought with him a most unwelcome gift from the east: the plague. This disease would claim around 2 million people in the empire and depleted Roman manpower, leaving the superpower weakened before the onset of the Marcomannic Wars. In 168 AD, news arrived in Rome that the tribes across the northern frontiers were causing problems in the Danubian provinces. One raiding party of the Marcomanni and Quadi tribes had penetrated the Alps and laid siege to Aquileia. The raiding party retreated once the two emperors came near to the city. The Quadi king died about this time, and to gain favour from Rome and defuse the situation, they sent embassies to Rome begging forgiveness for having rebelled, and exclaimed that they needed Rome's approval for their new king. Death of Lucius Verus. The two emperors pressed on into Illyricum before they were satisfied with the outcome. The plague was rampant in Aquileia, so the emperors never stopped there on their march back to Rome. In northern Italy, Lucius was taken ill. Some sort of seizure is described in our sources, perhaps a stroke. Lucius was taken to Altinum, where he survived for another 3 days, before dying. It's impossible to know what illness claimed the emperor's life, but some argue that it was the Antonine Plague. But this seems unlikely considering the suddenness of the ailment, and Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus were both travelling in the same carriage when Lucius suffered from this seizure. It's believed that the Antonine Plague was smallpox, rather than the bubonic plague. Smallpox generally begins with fever and body aches, followed by rashes on the body and blisters lasting for weeks. Symptoms Lucius Verus did not suffer from. We can't say for certain what killed the emperor, and we don't even know when exactly he died. but sometime in early 169 AD, probably January or February. Marcus Aurelius saw to his brother's deification. The same frieze that depicted Marcus and Lucius's adoption also depicts Lucius Verus's apotheosis. He is being guided by Victoria on a chariot up into the sky to join the gods. Final thoughts. There is no hint in our sources of Lucius Verus being malicious. He seems to have been a cautious individual, too fond of partying perhaps, or slanderous sources who overstate how much he actually loved to party. The Historia Augusta, which is usually very unflattering towards Lucius Verus, states that, towards Antoninus Pius, so far as it appears, Verus showed loyalty rather than affection. Pius, however, loved the frankness of his character and his unspoiled way of living, and encouraged Marcus to imitate him in these. It's worth considering our sources before passing judgment. Most contemporary sources show little sign of the more extreme character portrayal in our latter sources. Lucius's wife and Marcus Aurelius's daughter would later plot against Commodus, and thus Lucius was fair game by association. Many of our sources, like the Historia Augusta, were written under Commodus, and perhaps he harboured resentment towards Lucius Verus for this and other reasons. So to please the emperor, they perhaps depicted Lucius in a negative way. Lucius Verus is a character lost to history. We can't definitely say what kind of man he was. We do know that he led an effective campaign against Rome's greatest rival and delivered a smashing victory on the same scale that Trajan did 50 years earlier. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed the video, and also go check out the History Chronicles YouTube channel. The next video in this series will be on Marcus Aurelius. Subscribe to get notified when we upload future videos.